speaking during the period of the early republic. Just one moment, technical issue, good. Fellow citizens of our republic, I invite you all to share in our hospitality and to appreciate and indulge in our national pastime, drinking. We Americans are a nation of drinkers and a nation of innovators. As we have achieved our independence, we have become a commercial republic of citizens. We are now all men of business, merchants, bankers, tradesmen, and even farmers who do not merely plant and sow and subsist on their labor, but sell their goods throughout our land or even overseas. As we have changed, our drinks have changed. Tonight, we will discuss the drinks of our nation. We will briefly touch on punch, which is the communal aristocratic beverage of gathered gentlemen, our fathers and grandfathers. And we will then move on to that great American and that great Hudson Valley invention, that tribute to the bibulous genius of our republic, the cocktail. We're going to, in general, be talking about the forces that shaped cocktails and punches and early American mixology in general. What do the drinks themselves tell us about America in the 18th and early 19th century? One major thing to think about as we mix these drinks, as we drink them, is the ingredients of cocktails and punches. Every ingredient, except for water, must be produced and then bought and sold until it ends up in the bowl or in the glass. It may come from the other side of the world, or it may be a domestic product from America. In former times, these states were colonies, and they were a narrow strip against the Atlantic. They looked across the ocean toward Europe and toward our former colonial masters in Britain. We looked abroad and not within, not to our own nation. Now, we are an independent nation expanding across the continent. And our domains reach the Pacific, thanks to Mr. Jefferson's purchase. How has that changed the way we drink? It's also useful to bear in mind how people drink and how that shapes the drink itself. As people became more individualistic citizens and people, did they become more individualistic drinkers and consumers? Did communal drinks fall out of favor in favor of something that could be experienced more individually? In former times, we lived under a monarchy abroad and an aristocracy at home. In New York, the poltroons held a great deal of power, as they still do. But now every free male white citizen may claim some share of our republic. And does this democracy, which is becoming more powerful every day, especially with Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison's party in power, does this democracy produce a more democratic drink than an aristocratic constitutional monarchy does? And if so, what kind of drink is the drink of a democracy? So, to give a kind of prehistory of our drinks, we need to go back even beyond the times of our grandfathers, to a time when many of our ancestors had not even arrived on these shores. And this even goes back even further to the Chinese and Arabs, ancient alchemists and doctors. Spirits were originally introduced as medicine. Distilling alcohol was, for our purposes, invented by the Arabs and used as medicine. There were other inventions of it at other times, but our European ancestors got it from the Arabian, from the Arabs, from the Persians, the Turks, the peoples of the Middle East, and their cultures. And in the later Middle Ages, this is when this invention of alcohol spread into Europe and became more and more common. In the 15th and 16th centuries is when you see it start to be used recreationally. This is a period where you have the very beginnings of European liquors. They generally go by the name of aqua vitae, the water of life, which is their Latin name. And you see corruptions of this in almost every European language, from the obvious, like the Scandinavian akavit, to more obscure. The word whiskey through the Celtic languages is actually a variation on aqua vitae. So before we get into more about the history of spirits and mixology, we should talk about distillation and what it means. Distillation is boiling off the alcohol of a slightly alcoholic liquid or mash, and then collecting it into something that is extremely alcoholic. And this process is necessary to produce anything with an alcohol content of over around 15% by volume. Any other amount of alcohol will kill the yeast that are producing. Before the mid-19th century, all of this was done in a pot still, which looks like an alchemist's alembic. It's a large closed pot with a kind of tail coming up over the top, a kind of a teardrop shape, but then with a twisted top that goes off into the side. Early spirits were either unaged or they were aged very little. They weren't deliberately aged, generally speaking. You would put them in a barrel and that would age them somewhat, but you weren't necessarily keeping them around deliberately. The distillation process also had not yet been perfected and wouldn't be until a few centuries after their introduction. So there's a number of nasty tasting and hangover-inducing substances present in early spirits. These all meant that in order to make alcohol more palatable, it was best to mix it. And one of the first ways that that spirits were mixed with other things was in punch. It was probably invented by the factors of the East India Company sometime in the early 17th century, and it spread from there. It may have been inspired by non-alcoholic drinks in India. Punch did a number of things. It made alcohol delicious and easy to drink. And this made it preferred by wealthier drinkers, while the poorer often drank drams of straight liquor. There was a custom, especially by the 18th century, of dram drinking, which would be, it may sound classy to us whiskey drinkers, but it essentially means doing shots, to put it in 21st century terms. It has much the same connotation. Wealthier men would prefer to drink their spirits in punch. In addition, the citrus prevented scurvy, which was very useful for merchants and sailors sailing the Indian Ocean. By the 18th century, punch was everywhere in the Atlantic world. And punch, though, was relatively expensive, and it was an aristocratic drink. It was also communal. You gathered around a bowl with your friends for an entire evening, getting raucously drunk, singing bawdy songs, reciting poetry, debating philosophy, all the things that gentlemen in the 18th century liked to do. Playing whist. In the 18th century, there began to be advances in serving punch into something that was more individual and affordable. A man named James Ashley in London introduced punches by the glass and pre-bottling the ingredients of punch so that you would just mix in the spirits and then, serve it out, which allowed for much more efficient and cheaper service. So the other thing we should talk about is the role of alcohol in our young republic. Early Americans, the citizens of this young republic, drank a lot. There's an estimate, the estimate is around 4 gallons of grain alcohol equivalent per person per year in 1810, which is a bit over 2 drinks a day, around double the current amount, comparable to the alcohol consumption of Russia. But there's even more drinking going on than that implies. Much of the population were women, or they were enslaved people, or they were minor children. half of the population was women, half of the population were children, and a large portion of the population was enslaved. And so the alcohol consumption of adult white men, the ones who were doing more drinking than children and women and enslaved people, would be much higher than that of the general population. They were also the only people who could vote. And I will leave the political implications of the only people of the only voters and office holders being the drunkest segment of the population to your imaginations. The other thing that's happening in our young republic is that liquor is becoming a larger and larger proportion of Americans' alcohol consumption. Spirits consumption increases to the 18th century as rum, and it continues to increase into the 19th as whiskey. This is a process that is ongoing almost to prohibition. Americans just drink more and more spirits in preference of other drinks. Rum in the 18th century was thought to be fairly healthful, especially when drank as toddy, which we'll get into in a little bit, as was brandy. Gin, on the other hand, was associated with social disorder and was not as commonly drunk in early America as it was in places like Britain or the Netherlands, at least America overall. By contrast to spirits, which are these kind of, the other thing to keep in mind about spirits is that they are larger scale. Whereas the products of beer and cider are more locally produced. Wine, on the other, and often produced by women, that's another note. There were some commercial breweries in early America. A lot of the modern ones don't get started into large-scale German immigration in the 1830s or later. And that's where you get a lot of the kind of legacy breweries, some of which survive to this day. A lot of brewing was done on a fairly small scale by women in the home, in taverns, and things like that. Some types of beer, like stronger ales, might be imported, but a lot of the weaker beers would be locally produced. And cider was also generally locally produced, and it was very commonly drunk. It's a characteristically American drink. Wine, on the other hand, is a comparative luxury. It's always imported, and was mostly restricted to the more elite classes. So, with all of that out of our way, we can talk about the cocktail. Now, there were some precursors to the cocktail that are much more closely related to it than punch. The first is the sling. Slings are water, spirits, and sugar. They're like cocktails, but without bitters. They were popular with all classes of people in the later 18th and 19th centuries, but they had a more common connotation. They are the warm weather cousins of toddies, which are generally hot, though sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. Bitters is the other important piece of the kind of cocktails development. Bitters were created in England as medicine, and they were popular for dyspepsia or general stomach upsets, and for hangovers. This is maybe the origin of the kind of semi-legendary status of the hot cocktail as originating as a hangover cure. Bitters became popular in America and were produced locally by the 18th century, and drunk in fairly large quantities, so they may well have been somewhat weaker than modern bitters. So there's a number of early references to drinks that may be cocktails in the early 19th century. There's also there's a reference in the Farmer's Cabinet in 1803 that does not mention liquor and speaks to it being good for the head, presumably as a hangover cure. The first definitive reference in something like a recipe we have is from the Hudson Valley, just one county up the river from you in Columbia County in Hudson, New York. The reference is in the Federalist newspaper, the Balance and Columbian Repository. And they wrote, "Cocktail is a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. It is vulgarly called a bittered sling, and is supposed to be an excellent electioneering potion, inasmuch as it renders the heart stout and bold, at the same time that it fuddles the head. It is said also to be of great use to a Democratic candidate, because a person, having swallowed a glass of it, is ready to swallow anything else. Now, note a few things here. It's being associated with Democratic politicians, i.e. the candidates of the common people. The article implies that it's not a drink for refined palates, and it uses the word vulgar, which is an interesting choice. The overall picture is of a common, if not a lower class drink, then a working or middling class drink, certainly not the drink of a gentleman. And thus, they're not exclusive drinks. They're drinks for anyone. Unlike punch, which was a bit more leisurely, at least as traditionally served, cocktails could be drunk quickly by a single individual, like a sling could. This made them well suited to people who showed up to bars and taverns and drank briefly, rather than showing up in groups and drinking together. So this fits a more individualistic drinking culture than the communal culture of the 18th century. It's also suited to public taverns and maybe less suited to private clubs, where a lot of the punch tradition continued into the 19th century. So let's talk about the ingredients. The first one is sugar. Unless you grate nutmeg on it, this is the only ingredient of a cocktail that is not produced in America. In this way, the cocktail shows the independence of a country that is more economically self-reliant than it was as a colony. I generally put in 1 or 2 teaspoons, or around half a tablespoon, just to make sure everything's properly balanced. The next ingredient is water. One major difference between this and later cocktails is that it mentions water rather than ice. But it serves the same purpose, which is to dilute the spirits and also dissolve the sugar. Americans were crazy about ice from a very early period. Let me just stir this a little. Good. But they weren't yet putting it in cocktails, as far as we can tell. Generally, you should add about as much water as you add spirits, or less. I would say, though, at least add half as much water as you add spirits. The next ingredient is bitters. And you can omit these if you want to make a sling rather than a cocktail. And generally for bitters, I would say a tablespoon. If you're using weak bitters, I like to use bitters called Breckenridge. Or if you're using a strong bitters, about 3 or 4 dashes, maybe more, if you like it strong. And then finally, spirits of any kind, which in my case, I'm going to use whiskey, so that we get to talk about whiskey. Rye and bourbon whiskey was the American-made liquor for a more independent republic. While rum offered sugar producers in the Caribbean a good way to transport goods of great value across the sea, whiskey provides grain producers a way to add value to their goods and to package them more efficiently for transportation over land in North America. After independence, trade between the now independent United States and the Indies was disrupted by, among other things, one Horatio Nelson, a rather overzealous British officer. So domestic supplies of liquor became more important. There was also just a large number of farmers in the West who at this time did not yet have the Erie Canal to transport their goods eastwards in an efficient way in bulk. So the best way to concentrate their grain, their rye, their corn, was to produce whiskey and then send it on a wagon, or maybe even on a mule train. So one thing to note about these ingredients is that they're essentially the ingredients of the old-fashioned cocktail. And there's a reason for this. The old-fashioned cocktail was so named in the later 19th century or so, as cocktails became more complicated and added liqueurs and other exotic ingredients, absinthe, curacao, all sorts of things, vermouth, various fancy modern novelties. And so people that preferred a simple bitter sugar and spirits drink would ask for an old-fashioned cocktail. So the old-fashioned has been old-fashioned for up to 150 years, which is pretty extraordinary. Now, one last thing you can do if you want to, and I like to do it, though it kind of depends on which bitters you use, is to put nutmeg in my drink. I really recommend this if you make a slam. It really adds to the drink. And so I'm just grating my nutmeg. If you want, you can use pre-ground, but I do find that grated produces the best flavor. And let us drink to Jefferson and liberty, an independent republic of free citizens ruled by no man. So I now open the floor to questions.